Hi everyone, Ainsley here from Small Fry Creations, where we tackle everything DIY, and this week we're going to build some floating shelves with some simple shelf pin hardware from Amazon. Let me show you how we did it. This week's project is for the Rubbish Wood 21 Challenge, which was issued by Mark Dana from Dana Designs. And if you haven't checked out Mark, you certainly should. I'll leave some links in the description below for you to go ahead and do that. And as the name suggests, we had to take timber that was destined for the tip or for the rubbish and turn it into something beautiful and useful. And we had some friends recently moving house and they found a bunch of timber under the house and they offered it up to me, and the engineer found this piece of timber and saw beauty. And she said to me, I think we could make a really great floating shelf if we mixed this with some resin, so we're going to attempt that today. There is a ton of dirt, wormholes, all sorts of stuff through this timber. It's been sitting under the house for God knows how long. So our first step is we need to clean it up, and then we can start talking about a mold that we need to build to put this guy in and pour some resin. Let me start by saying this project is full of up and downs, so jump on the roller coaster and enjoy the ride. To clean up the wood, I used a wire brush mostly to brush out all the loose wood and dirt. I also used a toothpick thingy to pick out some of the leftover loose wood that hadn't packed their bags and moved on yet. Given how old this timber is, there was no straight edge, and I wanted to cut the timber in half to make two shelves. To run the piece through the table saw safely, I screwed a piece of plywood to one side, making sure the screws weren't too long but just enough to hold the plywood on. I could then run the plywood against the fence, which worked a treat in helping to keep the timber level and straight. The table saw blade was just not quite tall enough to get through the whole piece, so the last little bit had to be done by hand. This is tough work. I did get some timber wedges to put them in the timber once I had cut part way through to keep the timber apart, and this helped keep the blade from getting caught. Once split in half, I used a chisel to clean up the cut, and I could turn my attention to making the mould. Using 16mm melamine, I cut a bunch of 50mm strips, which would be the sides, and then some pieces for the bottom. In total, I was making 2 moulds, so I just took measurements from the pieces and made the moulds slightly bigger than the timber. To put the mould together, I pre-drilled and countersunk 40mm screws, making sure to pre-drill to stop any splitting. Given the challenge is by Mark, we should check square. Check square, check square, check square, check square. Thank you, Mark. We are square. Let's keep screwing and get this form together. These squares are great and available on Mark's website. I'll leave links below for you to go and check them out. If you're interested in any of the tools or accessories I use in the workshop, be sure to check out the affiliate links in the description box below. The forms are all made, but before we can get to putting the floating shelves in here and get to resining, we need to completely seal the forms to stop the resin from seeping out under the sides. And to do that, I'm going to use some wet area silicone. I'm pretty sure you can use any silicone, but this is what I've got on hand, so this is what I'm going to go with. I'm going to put it all around the seams, and I'm going to use a caulking tool to get a really nice smooth edge. Keep in mind, whatever edge you leave the caulk in is going to transfer onto the resin, so you don't just want to squeeze it on and leave it, you want to smooth it out. So I'm going to go ahead and do that process. We then have to wait 72 hours for these forms to completely cure, and then we can put in the floating shelves and get to resining. Even though I ended up rounding over the edges at the end with a router, smoothing over the silicone is important so that you get a nice clean edge, which will make life easier later on. I applied the silicone to all the seams and then used this cool caulking tool I picked up from Bunnings to make a nice seal. Some of the information I read online said you should line the mould with sticky tape to stop the resin from sticking to the melamine, but then others said you didn't need to. I decided to use sticky tape on one mould and nothing on the other, and let me tell you, one works better than the other. Hang on tight to see which one worked better. Alright, today is resin day. If you can tell, I'm a little bit nervous, because I have done this before, but not like this. But we are just going to dive in and have a go. I've got my 2 pieces of timber here. My first step is I need to seal coat it. And the reason why I'm seal coating it is because I have done my very best to get all of the dust and stuff out of here, but I'm sure there's some in here and I don't want it floating in the resin. So if I can seal everything in, then I can get them into the molds and then we can pour the resin. We're gonna have to do it in 2 stages. The resin I'm using is by Just Resin. It's a slow set, so I've got about a 40-minute pot life, but I can only pour 20 ml deep at one time. So we're gonna have to do it in 2 stages, which is fine. Let's get the seal coat first, then we can get these guys into the mold, work out a color that will work for us, and then we can pour the resin. Here comes the emotional roller coaster. The resin is a 3-to-1 ratio, so I worked out what worked best for the cups I was using and started the mixing process. I mixed for 3 minutes and a paddle pop stick works great for this. When working with resin, you need to ensure you're wearing gloves. I would strongly suggest wearing 2 sets of gloves because when you get stuff on your hands and you need to switch the gloves out, it's easier to take one pair off and put another pair on instead of trying to get gloves on sweaty hands. I applied the resin with a paintbrush and tried to get the resin in all the nooks and crannies. I needed to wait until the seal coat was sticky before pouring the first batch of resin, so while I waited, I worked out the colour. I knew I wanted blue and I wanted it to be translucent. I tried a couple of different blues and made sure to keep count of the drops going in so that I could get consistent colours across the batches. The colour I ended up going with comes from Amazon, and again, I'll leave links for all of these products below. I set the moulds in the timber with the help of the engineer and we got to mixing and getting ready to pour. The blueberry colour we chose ended up being 15 drops per cup of resin. I used some of my pony deep reach clamps to clamp the wood into place to stop it from floating, and the plywood is wrapped in sticky tape so that it wouldn't stick to the resin. Then came the moment of truth. We poured the resin in both moulds up to the 20 ml mark. The resin will have little air bubbles in it. They should release themselves, however, you can use a heat gun to remove them, which is what I did. Now we wait. That was very stressful. Resin is fun, but it's very, very stressful. I've poured up to the 20 ml mark and now I have to wait the 2 hours, then I can come back and do the final pour. It's really hard though to know if I'm at the 20 ml mark because the timber is all over the place, but I've done the best I can. If I make a mistake, it's just proof that I was trying. I'm gonna babysit this. I'll see you soon. All right, it's been the 2 hours, so now it's time to pour the next batch. I've got 2 cups ready to go. Hopefully that will be all we need. And then we can wait 24 to 48 hours at least until we demold it and see whether or not the hard work has paid off. So let's get these 2 poured, hope for the best, cross our fingers, and see what happens. This is where the real roller coaster began. I poured the resin so the timber was completely covered. My original plan was to have the timber covered in the resin. However, as you will see, this was not possible in the end. I had a ton of air bubbles coming up that just wouldn't go away. I used the heat gun and I sat with the resin for over an hour to try and get them to come out, but it just wasn't great. I think because the timber is so old, and let's face it, it's extremely rotten, there's so many air gaps that the resin couldn't fill in and the air just continually kept coming out. Hey. Feel like I'm at that part of the project where it could be a total failure or it could be a great win. The resin has not worked out the way that I wanted it to. There is air bubbles in it. I babysat it for an hour. I used a heat gun to get all the bubbles out and then went away, and when I came back the next day it looked like it does now. So I'm not feeling great about it if I'm being honest, but we have to keep pushing forward. That is what making is about. It's about learning, trial and erroring, and pushing on. So I'm gonna get this out of the mold and we're gonna start putting it through the thicknesser, and I'm just gonna start taking sections off at a time until I get to a point where I'm happy with how it looks, and then we can go from there. So let's get them out of the mold, have a look at really what they look like, and start fixing them up and making them hopefully look beautiful. This is where the sticky tape comes into play. The piece that had no sticky tape came out like a dream. I could remove all the screws and the piece lifted off the bottom quite easily. Now I think I'm gonna need a pry bar. Oh no. Ugh, just use brute strength. Woo! Then came the mold with the sticky tape. Use stickiest type, they say. It gets easier out of the mold, they say. They're lying. Anyone got any aggression they need to let out? Getting this resin out of the mold, I think, reflects how I currently feel about the project. Never using sticky tape again. Now that I finally had it out of the mold, I could start to run the pieces through the thicknesser, taking light passes each time. I wanted to get both pieces to the same thickness as well as remove the bubbles. Now pay no attention to the lack of dust collection. Turns out a section of the dust collection had come loose and wasn't completely sucking, so resin chips were being thrown everywhere. But things were starting to look up as the piece was starting to look halfway decent. I think I'm starting to get some confidence back. The boards have been run through the thicknesser a whole bunch of times, but it has revealed some holes or air bubbles that must have been in the resin. So what I'm going to do is apply a second coat of resin to fill in all of those bubbles, give it 72 hours to dry, and then more than likely put it through the thicknesser again, and then that will hopefully get everything level and nice, and then we can start sanding up through the grits and finish up this project. I poured resin in all the voids and again babysat it with a heat gun and tried to stop any further air pockets. I waited 72 hours and then put the timber through the thicknesser again. There were some air bubbles that I just couldn't get rid of on the surface, but it wasn't the end of the world. As you can see, I also fixed the dust collection, which was much better, and the helical head left a nice finish on the timber. I used my straightening jig on the table saw to get a straight edge on one side of both pieces, and then could run that edge along the fence to get parallel edges. I also cut the end square on the miter saw and both pieces to the same length, and I used a palm router to put a very small round over on all the edges excluding the back. Methylated spirits worked great to clean the pieces, and then I could start the big task of sanding. I started at 120 grit and worked my way up to 1000 grit. Cleaning with water in between grits helps stop any dust being sanded into the piece. I am feeling much better about this project. I spent the best part of an hour sanding everything up to 1000 grit. And when I got past 600, I wet sanded up to the 1000 grit, paying special attention to those resin areas. So now it is silky smooth. And we're up to the part where we're going to apply finish. So let's talk about finish for a second. I'm going to use a special finish from Scott from Custom Creations, and I will leave links in the description below to the finish that I'm using, but he has personally created a finish that is designed for wood and resin pieces like I'm doing today. So thank you, Scott, for getting me onto this. I'm gonna give it a go, and I think it's gonna turn out awesome. It's a two-step process, so I'm gonna apply step 1, and then I'll apply, obviously, step 2. And then we're up to the point where we can look at how we're gonna mount them and getting this thing on the wall, and then finally wrapping up this project. So let's get to work, get this finish applied, and keep moving. The custom creation grit finish was excellent. You simply apply step 1 and rub it into the piece and then wipe off the excess. You do the same with step 2, but I used my sander in turbo mode, and with a buffing pad on the sander I buffed the finish, and then again I wiped off the excess. The pieces came up beautiful with the finish,
finally, this piece was not looking so rubbish. I then left it overnight to fully cure and I could turn my attention to mounting the shelves to the wall.
We're up to the part where we're finally going to mount these shelves onto the wall, and my hardware has turned up from Amazon. I'll leave links in the description below for you. One end has a coach style screw which screws into a stud on the wall. That is a downside of this hardware, but having such a long shelf means it's going to be really easy for us to find 2 studs. The other end is just a simple pin, so I need to mark out where they need to be drilled, drill a 120mm deep hole, and then slide them onto the pins. I'm going to go ahead and get these on the wall first so I know exactly where my markings need to be, and then get the holes drilled and we can wrap this project up. There you have it, the shelves are all installed and they're looking good. If I'm gonna be honest, this project has really kicked my butt, but it does go to show that if you ride the roller coaster of the ups and downs and you have a little perseverance, it can result in a really great outcome because the shelves are on the wall and they're looking really good and I'm happy with them. If you're looking for other Rubbish Wood 21 challenge videos, be sure to search for it in YouTube and they should all come up. A huge thank you to Mark Dana from Dana Designs for hosting this challenge, and I hope you have liked this video. If you have, help me out by hitting those subscribe and like buttons, and I'll see you on the next one.